You're listening to the Surgeons of Horror podcast.
When there's no more room in hell, the dead will walk here.
Hello, welcome to the Surgeons of Horror podcast. Its purpose is to dissect and discuss horror films, both old and new. And we're continuing our discussions on the George A Romero chapter in his film work and the impact he had on the horror movie scene. And we're going to follow up from our first discussions, which was Night of the Living Dead, onto his classic sequel, Dawn of the Dead, which came out in 1978. Before we continue, I should introduce ourselves. My name is Saul Moite, and I'm joined by the delightful Greer Bellamy. Welcome on board, Greer.
Hi, thanks, Saul. It's great to be here.
So this is a really interesting film. We were just saying just off record, like 1978, the year that both of us were born.
Don't tell everybody.
Shh. But the reason I mentioned it is 40 years it's celebrating this year, or it's celebrated this year. It came out early in the year of 1978. But the purpose of this record, we're kind of timing this after the anniversary of Night of the Living Dead, which was 50 years ago in October 1978. And the reason I mentioned, like, by the time that we would have been kind of, I guess, savvy to films and stuff, this was already so embedded in the psyche of film lovers and horror film lovers. So just wanted to get your take on how aware of it were you, and when did you first come around to watching the movie?
For me, it wouldn't have been like early on at all, because I sort of hit my horror movie, strides in sort of my early to mid-teens.
Yes.
So, around the sort of early to mid-90s was when I really started to get into horror films. So it was probably at that point. I couldn't tell you exactly when, but it was probably about that point that I actually saw Dawn of the Dead, Night of the Living Dead, Day of the Dead. Is that
right? Yeah, Day of the Dead. Yeah.
Around that time, it was my peak Stephen King horror kind of Halloween, time.
Yeah. So we had you on board with our It discussions, and we were both commenting on how Stephen King made a huge impact on our reading, and was from a novel perspective introduction to the horror scene through books and literature. And part of the draw card was It, when we both watched them, and that was 1990. So I guess that's kind of the period that we're talking about, isn't it? Where
I didn't see It again until probably it was on television, which would have been about 92.
Yeah.
Australia back in those days was a little bit behind the rest of the world.
Well, yeah, so much so that they banned this film twice, Dawn of the Dead, I'm talking about twice, on its release. So 1978 they turned it down, and 1979 they turned it down because of the nature of the film. That's how forward Australia is. So, but it's interesting because from my point of view, I think I came into films a bit earlier than you were just discussing then. Because for me, like, my big entry into for me, it was Ghostbusters, 1984. And I remember being taken to the cinema to see that film. And it just opened up the door because, following that was the whole Back to the Future stuff. So I was really quite enamored by the celluloid screen from a little bit earlier. So I would have been 9, 10-ish at the time. And having older cousins, and I've mentioned this in another podcast, but having older cousins meant that I was watching things like Predator and RoboCop and pretty much anything that was action heavy at an age where I probably shouldn't have been watching them. But it meant that then opened the door for these other films that came out. I always seem to struggle myself to remember the first time I watched films. I'm the same with this one, Dawn of the Dead. I don't remember specifically when I did watch it the first time. Everyone knows it's the mall movie, it's the zombies in the mall. And that's been quite pressing. And I guess it rose to the attention when the remake came out, Zack Snyder's remake in the mid 2000s. so it kind of reintroduced it again to the modern audience at the time. But yeah, I mean, one thing we'll get to is that we'll discuss about where Dawn of the Dead fits now, and it has become a cult film in its own right, and has paved the way for many films to come. And as I said, we'll mention that as we get into the nitty gritty. But let's start talking about the plot of the film, because and then we can weave our way through the discussions of impact, and particularly raising the profile of zombies on the screen as well, which is the reason Romero became the godfather of the dead, or known as that.
It's quite funny what you were saying before about RoboCop and Ghostbusters, and because we did go to the movies a lot when I was a kid. You know, divorced parents, and like Dad loved the movies, always loved the movies, so we were always brought up with that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But I do remember after a couple of really bad experiences, RoboCop was one of them. Ghostbusters, not so much, although the beginning of that film in the library.
Yeah.
But the other one was Poltergeist 3.
Oh, wow.
After that, my dad sort of realised that there was an age that he should see certain films. So I think that was why my horror kind of stuff didn't really hit its strides till, the early to mid 90s, when I actually felt old enough to make these decisions for myself.
Sure. Yeah, well, that's understandable. I can get that. It's interesting the way we're introduced to films as well tends to be through our parents.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was my mum and dad that took me to Ghostbusters. And I think it was because I remember where we were. We'd gone to we were doing a trip up through Scotland. We were in Oban, which is like right up at the top easterly point. Hold on, I always get my east and west wrong. Westerly point of Scotland, and there wasn't really much to do there. There was a cinema that had 2 films, and it was that or something else, but that was the only option for taking kids to go and see. So I remember being really scared of the library sequence, but like I came out of it loving that film so much, and I really feel like it had a huge impact on me, hopefully in a good way. So yeah, where were we? So yeah, let's talk about the plot. So yeah, that's right. I was trying to remember where I'd gone. So Romero had already kind of established the world that the zombies were living in through Night of the Living Dead. So he didn't really need to then go back and explain the rules around that. He could pretty much open with this crisis, this virus that's been kind of attacking humans and turning them into zombies without really too much explanation. It's more the impact that the humans have and what they're trying to deal with it. And pretty much it's pandemonium from the get-go. Something I really like about Romero's work, especially in this, and if you compare it to The Crazies as well, is these kind of little news bulletin things that he does to really kind of showcase the anarchy that's on display in America, where the film's set, and people's confusion and not really knowing what to do with it, and this is kind of where we see ourselves, at the very beginning. The National Guard has been coming in to try and fight these zombie hordes in these open terrains, and but they're kind of largely overrun and not really able to cope. And we open up with within the news studio, and it's in Philadelphia from memory. And we're about 3 weeks into where this phenomenon has broken out, and we get introduced to two leads in the film. There's Stephen and Francine. I'm not really sure what Stephen's role was within the news team. I think was he just the pilot for the? I
thought he was the chopper pilot, the news pilot.
But he comes over and he's like telling Francine that they need to kind of get away. Let's just get in the helicopter and escape the city before it gets too crazy. And Francine looks like she's like either a production assistant or something within the news network. And she's kind of a little reluctant to leave her post, and I think it's the camera guy that kind of turns to her and just says, "Yeah, you may as well just go. Like, there's not a lot that's been going on here, and they'll be shutting down soon." So that's kind of our first introduction to these two two new leads, and we are closely then introduced to the other two, which is these police SWAT officers. There's Roger, I think they call him Trooper as a nickname, and he's on a team raid, like was it like a housing project of some kind, where these a few of the residents aren't kind of abiding by this martial law, and they're starting to fight back. So they're kind of there's just laying on this anarchy that's kind of unfolding, and like the SWAT team are trying to kind of pin everything down whilst dealing with these zombie outbreaks at the same time.
Yeah, I found the chaos in the beginning quite still like jarring.
Yes,
and I think it was probably because when I've rewatched it now, I've only rewatched this. I haven't rewatched Night of the Living Dead. And so I found myself in a situation where I was kind of sitting there for a little while just wondering what the hell is actually happening. Yes, I understand that there's a zombie apocalypse, but I just I can't remember. It's just so long ago that I can't remember if I've missed something really significant.
Yep.
Plot-wise in the first film that has, kind of got us to where we are. So it took me a little while in the beginning to actually get to a place where I was like, okay, right, I understand like where the world is right now.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was a good 10 years after the first film came out, so it was a big gap. And, his first three films, they all can stand alone in their own right, even though they're part of a trilogy. The stories do stand alone. But there is that sense of knowing it's a sequel that you're trying to go, all right, well, am I needing to put pieces together here or not? And you don't really need to, but you don't know that when you're watching it from the beginning. But I quite like that anarchy. I like that sense of because it's just it's a indicator of what's to come. There are no rules now. It's just everyone for themselves. So we were introduced to Trooper, who's kind of he's trying to get through, and he meets up with Peter, played by Ken Foray, who people might recognize in the recent Rob Zombie films. That's cropped up. He was in The Devil's Rejects and Lords of Salem. And Halloween actually played a role in the Halloween film. So so he meets Peter, who's just another member of the SWAT team, and they kind of form a bit of a bond and partner up. And they meet up with Steven, the pilot, and he's saying that he's going to steal the helicopter and flee. And that's when Peter says they'll come with him, but not before Peter and Roger go down to this kind of basement where they hear that these zombies are trapped in the basement. And they go in and basically there's a point where they go in the house first, and there's like an apartment, and they go in and there's a zombie there, and they basically shoot his head off, completely blows his head apart. And the reason I mention that one is because Tom Savini is working on this film, who a lot of fans will know from his special effects, namely his work initially on Friday the 13th. Friday the 13th didn't come out till 1980, and this was his kind of debut feature as a makeup artist. He was supposed to be working with Romero on Night of the Living Dead, but he was called out to work in Vietnam and fight for his country. And what he witnessed there was such a huge impact on him creatively that you see that in a lot of his work. He was always wanted to go for realism, and basically his method was that if it doesn't look like the real thing from what he witnessed, then it's which shocked him and completely disorientated him and everything that came with that, and he wanted to be able to use that in film. And he's probably one of the most famous special effects artists as a result of that. And that first scene we see with the head blowing up with the corpse is actually a lot of people heard about that this was going to happen, and so there was a lot of people that came down to watch that on the set when it happened. And the effect was so good that they were just like, okay, now we know what we're in for. It's going to be this kind of a movie. So yeah, pretty full on. But yeah, Savini's work is just embedded through this, and for me, it's what makes this film so much richer. And we'll discuss the way the film looks a bit further down the track. Essentially, like they get down to the basement, and there's just like hordes of these zombies just kind of lying around, just this cannibalism. Essentially, there's kind of eating rotten flesh, and yeah, pretty grim.
But what you would expect from a zombie film.
Yeah, what you'd expect from a zombie film. So, like, my point is the tone is really set. So, that night, we get Roger and Peter kind of catching up with Francine and Stephen, and they get in a helicopter and they make their way to out of Philadelphia. They stop for some fuel along the way as well. But there's one scene where, while that's happening, where Peter goes into, I want to say it's the store, and there's these two kid zombies that come out, and he just kind of has to fend them off and shoot them and kill them. And Ken Foray, who played the role of Peter, said that was the most difficult scene that he had to do, was like, shooting these zombie kids. And I know from now being a parent, and I know you're about to become a parent, that the way you look at life, and especially things like this, changes a lot, because it is really quite harrowing when you see that unfold. So yeah, pretty shocking moment. And then the next bit is actually quite a famous iconic kill, I should say, where troopers filling up the helicopter with petrol, and behind him there's a zombie coming towards him, and he's not really aware of it. And the zombie stands up on top of this crate, only to have his head, kind of the top of his head, sliced off from the helicopter blades.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, like Savini's reading this stuff and go, right, oh, okay, so we have to have the top of his head come off, and right, okay. And so, and hearing it from the actor's point of view that played the zombie as well was interesting, because he's talking about how he had this extra bit on top of his head, and the whole thing would just kind of whip off, and then like you have the blood spurting out at the top. So, like there was a lot of inventiveness that was going on with this. Yeah, and the freedom as well was something that's really quite apparent. Like the freedom to explore and be creative. Like Romero was quite known for letting actors and the people he worked with come up with ideas and kind of be a bit experimental in what they do. Like the lady that plays Francine, her name's Galen Ross. She had no prior acting experience prior to the film being made, but she soon discovered that she could work on her character and offer these suggestions up to Romero, and he was more than willing to let her explore that and delve into that character a little bit more. She, being the token female as well, she felt quite isolated and wanted to use that a lot in the way she portrayed her character. You got a lot of like very kind of testosterone heavy kind of male showmanship going on. And she's often viewed as the weak link in the of the four. I mean, like within themselves. I'm not saying as a viewer, which is kind of interesting when she's the survivor at the end. So it's in a sense, it's almost kind of she's a heroine in her own right, even though she comes at it from a very different viewpoint from what we know of heroines today in the horror scene.
And I mean, with throw in a spoiler alert there, obviously as well. She's pregnant, so
yeah, that's right. So even more this kind of feeling of vulnerability, but with that, she's everything that everything about a woman is portrayed within her character. She is pregnant, so she has these maternal instincts that are kicking in, and this protectiveness. She is the bearer of the next generation that will be being born into this post-apocalyptic world, not knowing what that means as well. So there's a lot going on with her character that should be given more credit for, especially in the decisions that she makes throughout the film. So essentially, so we have this scene, and then they eventually end up at the mall, the shopping mall, and they're kind of flying overhead, and they kind of realize that they could be onto a good thing here because everything you need is at the mall, and so they kind of they land down and they kind of make it their sanctuary, and they come in from the so they land on the roof, and they have this kind of main section of roofs. That's where all the staffing area would have been, and so that's kind of, I guess, their main camp, for want of a better word, where they set up, so they can then come down into the mall itself to get their needs, and then kind of remain up in this top area, and just kind of basically go down when they need to. The conversation around the politics around this film is, or the way, or a sociological point of view, is how we tend to gravitate to shops. It's like it's our new church, essentially. Like, you go back centuries, and the church was the medium for which people would go to get their riches, so to speak, because they need their reward within faith. But nowadays it's commercialism and consumerism. And I don't know how aware Romero was of that comment when making this film, but it's certainly something that hangs with it afterwards when you watch the film. Basically, like, there's zombies all kind of still coming to and from this, within the complex of the mall itself. So the group decide to try and block up the mall entrances with trucks, just to keep the undead outside, and then somehow contain the ones inside to make it more manageable. Peter and Stephen make this kind of barrier as well across the stairwell, just up to where they're living as well, just kind of, again, add more security to where they are. And there's a lot of like stuff going on during this period, and they decide to they're trying to make it a barricade, a fortress, if you will, to make it as safe as possible. And there's this scene where they're kind of going in through the mall itself and trying to get goods that they need to help them. And the attitude for me, I don't know if you notice this, but the attitude of of Roger changes a little bit. Like, he becomes a bit of a king of his domain sort of thing. He's a bit more, ironically, they call Stephen Flyboy, but for me, has this Flyboy attitude to stuff, like he becomes a lot more reckless as he's going through the mall. And, there's this great bit where this was reintroduced afterwards, but he has this jacket around. He takes this jacket, he ties it around his waist, and then when they came to cutting it towards the end of the movie after it was shot, they realized that there was a continuity error, because later on in that same scene, he's not got the thing around his waist anymore. So they basically devised a way of having a zombie. So they went back to reshoot a scene where a zombie tries to grab at Roger and in doing so pulls the jacket off him, all for the sake of just trying to get around that continuity.
I feel like some continuity is something people didn't care so much about 40 years ago as they do now.
No, I know. That's a good point. And it's one thing that's, I know it's a bugbear for a lot of people, but I know it's something Ant is pretty quick at picking up on stuff when he's watching things. It's quite funny watching stuff with him. But yeah, so lucky. Roger's becoming a bit reckless, and so when they try and do this barricade, he has this cowboy attitude. It's almost like he's having a bit of a mental break, isn't it? Like, he's becoming really unhinged a little bit. And in doing so, he ends up getting bitten by one of the zombies. So we kind of know that his days numbered because of that. Although he does hang around for a little bit longer yet.
Definitely lingers.
Yeah, before he turns. So they do clear the interior of the zombies by doing this whole, kind of almost what was it when you kind of steer a cattle anyway, like in a certain direction to try and move them through?
One of my favourite scenes was them sort of running in and out of this department store, not in and out, but inside this department store to different places to try and distract the zombies so they would come to one entrance so that they could, sneak things out of the other. Yeah, it was, I mean, we all know zombies are stupid, let's face it.
These ones are, the slow ones are, that's right.
They are.
Go on, Gary.
Oh no! I just found it quite amusing. I feel like we see so many zombie things these days that it's all become very formulaic in how it's kind of done and the stereotypes and whatnot. But it was interesting to go back and watch an older zombie film and see kind of almost like the revolution, not evolution.
Evolution, yeah.
Of zombies.
Yeah, it is, and that's the thing. That's why I think it is an interesting film to go back and watch on, because this is the one that really set. Despite the fact Night of the Living Dead has already occurred, this for me is the movie that really established the zombie film culture in its own right. It became such an iconic cult film.
I think as well, because Night of the Living Dead was black and white.
Yeah.
So it didn't have quite the punch and it did, but in terms of visually and the effects that you could do and all that sort of thing, it just didn't have quite the impact, the visual impact that Dawn of the Dead did.
Yeah, that's right. I completely agree. So it's interesting as this stuff unfolds. So there's this scene where there's a nun character outside one of the shops, and she has something caught, I think, in the door, and Francine basically opens the door and shuts it. In the original script, she's supposed to kill the nun zombie, and Romero actually came up to her and goes, "We're gonna have to change the script." And she goes, and Francine, Galen, who plays Francine, said, "Oh, why?" She goes, "Yes, I just can't bring myself to kill a nun." So he changed it to just let the nun go, essentially. So of all these things, that he's okay killing kids, but but for him
that crosses the line.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, there's quite another sweet, like I say sweet, in as much as she's sitting. I think the guys are running around. They might even be collecting all the zombies to get them out of the mall after that mass kill, and she's sitting inside one of the stores with her gun, and she's playing with the pistol, and there's like a youngish guy sitting on the other side of the door, and they're just kind of staring at each other, and I don't know, it was just quite an interesting. It was it was quite interesting to me, and just in kind of like almost the impact of that. I'm trying to think of the words. Sorry, baby brain.
No, that's right. Well, that's exactly what's going on with her too. Yeah. Like she's I'm wondering if it is that she's at that point contemplating what's about to occur. Like is this going to be her life? She's got this baby she's going to bring into the world, and she's watching this young guy, as you said, across the way, and thinking, is that going to be the life of my child? Like what is it? So that's how I took it, and it is. You're right. It's this quite beautiful moment within the scene.
Kind of moment.
Yeah, for sure. So they've cleared the interior, as I said. The four kind of start having this bit of a lifestyle and treating the goods for themselves, and but eventually Roger does succumb to his wounds, and there's this. It's quite a comical moment when he reanimates, because he's lying in bed, and the sheets are over his head.
Yeah.
And it slowly comes down, and like you see that he's gone. Zombified, and all this time Peter's just standing there behind a crate with a gun, waiting
for it.
Yeah, and he shoots him, kills him dead.
Before we get to that point, there is that really nice moment where he asks and he says, make sure I turn, and then take care of me.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. You're right, and that is a good point to raise as well. because it says a lot about their friendship, but it also says about the psyche of the two men too, because they're military first and foremost. They're from the SWAT team, so they have this kind of very practical mindset with things that they know each other will get the job done if it comes to that. But it's just like, just make sure I am not me before it happens. So for which Peter duly obliges. Then I think you get the idea that a few months kind of pass. With the three that are left.
Yeah, there's a bit of progression in the pregnancy, and and there's a few kind of like almost like moments of levity where like they're like raiding the stores and they're having like nice intimate dinners, and there's she's putting on makeup, and
that's right. Yeah.
So you kind of think that life is kind of going on inside this mall.
Yes.
Even though really there's only 3 of them who live there.
Yeah, that's right. It's almost they're trying to normalize things, get back to what was once before, about, having dinner and being civilized, So they start to hear these transmissions on the radio that kind of are suggesting that the government has ceased to be. It's kind of collapsed. Most of the population now, it sounds like, have been killed or reanimated. So we're getting like a news from the outside world a little bit. They realise that they might have to leave the mall because it might not be so safe to stay where they are. So they start to prepare to leave it. Get ammo and supplies and start loading it into the helicopter. In case of an emergency, so they've got everything they kind of need. And then not long after that, we get these kind of this gang of motorcyclists that kind of crop up in the scene. Among them is Tom Savini himself, as one of the main motorcycle riders. And so sorry, my throat's really starting to play up. So he's one of the crew that turn up with these kind of motorcyclists, and they can kind of tell as they're arriving that they're almost like a tribal kind of pack, and they're going to have some problems because, they're a gang, and so they're gonna see them all, and they know that they're just going to rip it apart and use it for everything that they can get out of it. So this haven that they have, they know is not going to last much longer.
That's the plot of every season of The Walking Dead.
Yes.
It's your classic kind of Lord of the Flies type scenario. That when you're in this situation, there is always going to be, some people who go to the extreme.
Yeah, that's right. And so, and we get this sense of anarchy coming back into the movie as a result. So like where we started off essentially is where we're ending up with the introduction of this group, and as they eventually do break into the mall, they kind of treat it as their playground at first, but with that they are allowing more zombies into it, so they're kind of destroying what the 4 had originally set up as this kind of almost like a castle, as I said, to kind of protect them from the outside world. But the gang don't really kind of care about that. They're riding on their bikes through the mall, and it's one of the most famous scenes. Really, is having these bikes kind of tearing through the mall, and they're kind of killing these zombies and fighting them off left, right, and center. And then like the weird part is the introduction of the custard pie fights that start happening, and I don't know who it was that introduced that to it, but it's one of the things that resonated when the film released in a positive way, because it was kind of, even though it was anarchy, there was this upbeat kind of slapstick kind of thing going on at the same time, which was in juxtaposition to the anarchy that was unfolding outside of the mall and that was slowly creeping inside the mall. All these kind of barriers that were set up in place are torn down, and so these zombies are kind of getting free reign again. so we have this bit where Peter and Stephen are trying to, you know, they initially start to try and prevent the loop from happening, but you know, it doesn't happen, and Stephen kind of gets a bit enraged at this point too, because he becomes quite protective. He's like, this is our place, and so he kind of goes a bit off the handle a little bit. And Peter and Stephen, like, you know, they flee the apartment, you know, so they leave Francine up in the apartment space while they try and sort things out. Stephen, though, he gets shot in the arm just as he's going through. It goes into the elevator shaft, and he gets kind of cornered by the undead, bitten several times, and then he's becomes consumed by the zombies. And it's this great iconic moment again in the film where the lift doors open and you have Stephen coming out as a zombie. So, you know, where he's turned, and it was for hearing it from David MG's point of view, who plays Stephen. It's like, you know, he felt quite intimidated because up to then there were all these fantastic kind of actors playing zombies, and he was like, how am I going to do this? Because they've been so believable in their portrayal of what a zombie is. And he's like, you know, and there's this moment where one of the characters is going to become a zombie, and how will that look? And he decided to use his wounds to portray the way he would walk. So, like, he's been shot in the arm, so that's why his arm is quite limp, and he's been bitten on the neck, so his neck is slightly at an angle, and that's how he kind of moves and is quite contorted. And you see that, like, when you hear that and then watch the way he performs, you can really see his thinking behind that, you know. And it's one of the most iconic images is that moment when the lift opens and he's reanimated. And you kind of wonder how they're going to get out of it, really. Like, you know, things are getting quite hectic at this point. Peter's kind of still going around trying to shoot the zombies and free himself. And the reanimated Stephen, there's this whole play on how they use this a lot throughout this film. For the first time in the trilogy and zombie, what we're trying to say, zombie mythology afterwards, is that the zombies have retained some sort of memory, so they instinctively start to do stuff that they used to do in their previous life. It's almost like this cognitive kind of impression that's inbuilt within them. Muscle memory, exactly, yeah. And so Steven starts to do that with the hideout where they were. So, like, he kind of instinctively knows that there's a false wall, and he breaks through it in the stairwell that's leading up to the undead and where Francine and Peter are. But he kind of gets his way up to the top, and that's the point where Peter, you know, just kills him. Again, going back to the point where, you know, he's a member of the SWAT team, so, like, everything's quite black and white with him. Peter has shot and killed Stephen, but the reanimated Stephen, and because of zombie Stephen's actions, the dead are kind of coming up into their kind of apartment space that they've made, their sanctuary, and so they've got no option but to leave, you know. So Francine climbs up through the skylight, and Peter at this point is looking like he's just going to give up. He's like, you know, he's turns to suicidal thoughts, and he's just like, you just go, you know. And he's standing there with the gun to his head, and you think he's just going to give up on it all as the zombies are coming in. But then he has this kind of, you know, sudden change of heart, and then he fights his way back up onto the roof where he joins Francine, who at this point is getting ready to fly. The helicopter and the two of them just kind of fly away with this helicopter that's not got a lot of fuel left in it, and their future's uncertain, and that's when the credits roll. So a bit of a open-ended conclusion to the film, where there is no real option, there's no hope, really, is there? There's no solution that's presenting itself. left to their own devices. They, as I said, uncertain of what's to become. But I guess before we comment on that, like the original screenplay actually had Peter killing himself.
But leaving Francine on her own.
No, because Francine is in the helicopter and she ends up sticking her head up into the blades of the helicopter because she doesn't see any point in continuing either. So it was like this really grim ending. Yeah. Wow. So when you think of that and where they've left things, it was definitely the better choice to go the way they went. But where does that leave things? This uncertainty and not really knowing what the future holds. And I guess none of us really know what the future holds. So
there's a bit of a parallel. I mean, I guess in terms of the zombie apocalypse, like the only certainty is uncertainty.
That's right.
Really. So it's hardly surprising that they went with that direction, because trying to, like them killing themselves is a definitive, well, that's it.
Yeah.
These characters, let's just do a new film with a new cast.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Pick up a new story, which they effectively do with Day of the Dead.
Yeah.
There's a nice synergy between the ending of this one and the beginning of the next one, where the new characters are in the helicopter going over a city terrain. So it's this kind of nice link up between the two. But yeah, it's an interesting ending, like I said, and it does present itself with this kind of what would you do moment. So what were your final thoughts on the movie when you rewatched it this time round? Like, where do you now place yourselves with it? Because we was talking at the beginning of the film of our podcast, in that it's become this cult film in its own right, huge following. But where do you think it stands today if people were to watch it today?
Look, I really I appreciate it for what it was, and it was quite ahead of its time, I guess.
Yes.
In terms of, like its predecessor was black and white, it was coloured. So no, look, I think in terms of the, a film that's 40 years of age, that its predecessor was black and white.
Yes.
And in terms of the use of colour and, to try and kind of have an impact, with like the blood and the gore and, and even just things like the scene that I mentioned earlier where Francine is putting makeup on,
yes,
it was very exaggerated and whatnot. I think that's all been done to really good effect in its time.
Yeah.
But on the converse side of it, I feel like 40 years later, I have seen so many zombie films that have, and so many TV shows and whatnot, that it feels a bit, it feels like they all do to me these days.
Yeah.
They feel kind of very similar. It's always the same, kind of there's a small group of heroes, then there's, anti-heroes or whatever.
Yes.
Yes. Then you've got your motorcycle gang in this, in this case, or you've got the people, like the opposing side. I think I can really appreciate it for what it is, but while I was watching it, I was kind of a bit, ooh, this does not, like, it does not feel like, the zombie films of today, definitely.
Yeah, it's kind of a little bit dated in that respect, isn't it? And and I guess that's why, yeah, as sacrilegious as it was, you can kind of see why there was a desire to remake the film. And even though, personally, that film actually stands up kind of semi-decently, to appeal to a modern audience. There's something else that's kind of I neglected to mention, and it's integral to the making of this film, was the fact that it had the editing, or the distribution editing rights of the film in the European circuits fell into the hands of Dario Argento, who people know from his films like Suspiria and Deep Red. He had a significant impact on the horror movie scene in the late 70s, and he'd heard about Romero's desire to kind of make this film, and he actually encouraged Romero to come out and stay at his place in Italy when he was writing the script. And he basically kind of persuaded Romero to let him edit the film for the Italian industry, and because of that, had a huge impact on the European kind of horror circuit and film circuit, and it became it trebled its impact on on a global circuit. It spawned its own kind of deviated sequels as a result, because in Italy it was released as Zombie but without the E on the end, and then consequently there was two other films that kind of followed that, which were was the sequel was directed by Lucio Fulci, came up with Zombie 2, and there was Zombie 3. In Britain they would be known as Zombie Flesh Eaters as their film titles, and with Argento's work, it was rescored as well by Goblin, who provided the music to Suspiria. So it had this very kind of unique sound to it as well, which was a very kind of different feel. And I mentioned it purely because it kind of reawakens the zombie culture films in Europe and spawned these whole new films, and the impact it had. You mentioned a few weeks back when we were talking about doing this, you got to mention Shaun of the Dead as well. This film Dawn of the Dead was so spawned such a iconic base, if you will, that inspired so many filmmakers after it, that so many other things kind of
came of it.
Like you got to talk about Return of the Living Dead, which was written by John Russo, who had written Night of the Living Dead, and he teamed up with Dan O'Bannon, the writer of Alien, and they wrote Return of the Living Dead, and that had its own series of films that spawned off the back of this.
I would be really interested to see this in the way it was cut for a European audience.
Yeah.
Because I do, like, now that you've said that, I was completely not aware of it, but the very different styles of filmmaking, and I could see how it might be a completely different film with a different edit, definitely different sound design, because that's something that we didn't touch on, but some of the sound design was quite, I found it almost comical. It felt a bit, it felt like it was meant to be quite light. It didn't real somber, necessarily somber feeling. Quite interesting to see.
Yeah, me too. I mean, it's something that I haven't actually had the chance to do, and I probably should, seeing as I've watched the original so many times. Even like when I don't have the notes in front of me, but when Romero first released this, I think it was for one of the big film festivals like Cannes or something like that, where he needed to get it out, and it was quite a long film, and he ended up having to cut it back for its original release. So that's why there's a thing called the director's cut out there, which was the original one that he'd set up for that. So there are various different versions of this. And actually, I think it was only a couple of years ago there was a Blu-ray release in the Italian market which had the Argento cut produced in 4K. So it's definitely out there for watching.
Wow. Okay.
And I think it does include the original theatrical cut and the extended Cannes cut of the film in that one. So it's definitely, fans of this film should definitely get that one. As we said as well, there was a remake of this film as well. So it's definitely been in or around and had a significant impact. For me, like when I watch it, there is this dated feel of it, but there is this also this nostalgicness that comes with it. The whole kind of concept of it being set within a mall, and everything that comes with the imagery that comes with that, coupled with Savini's work in this, because the effects are pretty kind of gory, suitably gory, and I'm a fan of the practical effects in films, and I do like kind of seeing that on display. And as I said, at the forefront, Savini was a master of his work, and he still is. He's still creating stuff to this day. And so for me, it does elevate it slightly above probably where the film would sit from a neutral point of view. If somebody was coming at this from a neutral point of perspective, they may not like it as well as, say, a true horror fan like myself would. But saying that, I do kind of see that it is dated, and it has got a stilted feel to it these days when you compare it to the likes of the fact that, as I said, all those films that we were mentioning that come out, you throw in the fact that 28 Days Later just shake things up a bit by having the fast zombies and stuff. You've got The Walking Dead, which is continually shuffling its way on the screens as we speak. Dragging its dead corpse around. But even like just recently, like, so at the time of this record, this is coming out in October when we release this, but at the time of the record, there's a film called The Cured that's come out on DVD, I think, called The Cured. It stars Ellen Page. It's an Irish film. And I really recommend people watch it because I think it's actually offers a different take on the zombie culture, in the sense that it's looking at the fact that zombies, people that have been infected, there's a cure. And so they become human again, but they still retain the memories of when they were zombies and the impact that has. And there's a whole kind of racial divide that happens. People aren't willing to accept the cured, as they call them, back into society because of what they did. It's a very clever film because of that, and because it's set in Ireland and the unrest that is continuously in Ireland anyway. It adds to that kind of tension within the setting. It's a good film, and as I said, offers a whole new take on the genre, which is kind of cool.
Which is, I think, kind of what the genre needs.
Yeah.
I think that's been my thing the last couple of years. For a while there it was vampires, and then now it's been zombies. 28 Days Later obviously happened quite a while ago.
Yeah.
The last few years there's been a lot of zombie.
Yeah, you got to look. I still cringe at Warm Bodies, the rom-com.
Yeah.
That to me is just pushing it a bit too far.
But that being said, there is some good zombie stuff. Like I quite enjoy iZombie.
Yeah, I was literally thinking that.
Yeah. It's like, again, it's a slightly different take on on the whole zombies genre, and it's gone a bit weird, but I did love the last season. But
yeah, me too. Yeah, I think that's a good example of trying something a bit different that's quirky and a bit fun and works.
And Walking Dead lost me, around the same time Negan came in. So
yeah, I know. I think it's lost a lot of people. And there's strong rumours about the direction it's going in the next series as well, which is going to really shake it up. Which for me, if it's true,
it needs
it's going to be the final nail in the coffin for that film. Personally, not film series. Cool. Well, look, I think that kind of wraps us up. Unless there's anything else you want to add to our discussions on Dawn of the Dead. Any last thoughts on the film?
No, I don't think so. I think I've kind of covered everything I want to say. As I said, I'd love to see this European cut, because I do think actually that would be quite interesting.
Yeah, me too. I am tempted. I don't know at what point, but I am tempted to delve into the Argento kind of films, because personally he had such a huge impact on my horror movie experience. But there's a few more of these to shuffle through yet before I get to him. But he's definitely at the forefront of my mind when I do these discussions. Cool. Well, look, I completely agree. At some point we will kind of no doubt reawaken that one and have a look at that. Well, until then, it's probably time to sign off. And I'd just like to say, on behalf of myself, Saul Morte, thank you for tuning in and listening. And once again, thank you, Greer.
Thank you. Thanks for having me again.
No worries. And good luck with everything going forward with you. Big changes abound.
As long as I'm not flying off in a helicopter with who's chasing me, I think I'm in a pretty good place.
That's right. Okay, until next time, keep on listening for more Romero discussions as we shuffle our way through the Walking Dead series. Goodbye.
You're listening to the Surgeons of Horror podcast. Music supplied by Peter Nezik. For more discussions or podcasts, head over to surgeonsofhorror.com or head over to our Facebook and Twitter sites for the latest news and updates.